of God's Word, go ahead and turn into 1 Samuel chapter 29. Pastor Steve did a great job last week with the King's Kids from 1 Peter chapter 2, and we're going to dig back into 1 Samuel. We will be in chapter 29 tonight and chapter 30 the next week, and I believe 2 weeks from tonight we will wrap up 1 Samuel. But don't worry, we'll get right back into 2 Samuel because there's a whole other book that we have to look at in regarding Samuel, his life, in ministry. 2 weeks ago when I was with you, we looked at a very obscure, very peculiar passage of Scripture that maybe some of you are still kind of wrestling with. I know I still am, as it was quite interesting. 1 Samuel chapter 28, verses 3 through 25, we looked at Saul, who was a hopeless human. I asked you the question 2 weeks ago, how does this passage reflect the dark, hopeless hole that Saul had fallen into, and how can we avoid this kind of hopelessness? And we looked at how fear engulfs Saul, desperation guided his steps, Samuel's death sentence, and Saul's last meal. Now, none of those points accurately described exactly what we went through in that text. So to tell you, we studied that Saul actually went and consulted a witch, right? And the witch brought up Samuel, and Samuel came and spoke from the dead, and it was interesting. And so after we preached that, I decided to reach out to a group of pastors online that I talked to, and I wanted their thoughts, and they actually enjoyed it. They thought it was interesting, and they agreed that it was a difficult text, but not many have preached through that. So there you go, for what it's worth. 1 Samuel 29 tonight, as we continue in Samuel, I want to speak to you briefly on a sermon I've entitled, An Expected Exemption. An Expected Exemption. So what happens tonight is chapter 29 is going back to verses 1 and 2 of chapter 28. In other words, when we got into verse 3 2 weeks ago, we paused on David and his life, and we resumed with Saul and what Saul was doing. So tonight we're going back and kind of talking about what David was doing while Saul was doing what he was doing, right? And so the sermon in its sentence tonight is in what readers on the outside looking in would expect. David is exempted from military service in the Philistine army. The objection from the Philistines may have stung, but the omnipresent hand of God was all over the situation, and I put comma again, because he's always over the situation. And so when you look at this passage tonight, we've got to remember that chronologically within the Bible, it picks up with 1 Samuel chapter 28, verses 1 and 2. And so that's where we are. And while the events that we're going to learn about tonight were happening, while those were happening, Saul was disguising himself and venturing into the night to have a meeting with a witch that he had previously casted out of the nation, right? And so that was happening. So while David is having this conversation with Achish, that was happening with Saul. Now, let's go back in your Bible to 1 Samuel 28, and let's read verses 1 and 2 because they kind of go right into verse 1 of chapter 29. In those days, the Philistines gathered their forces for war to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, "Understand that you and your men are going to go out with me in the army." David said to Achish, "Very well. You shall know what your servant can do." And Achish said to David, "Very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life." Now, here's the situation. We kind of have to back up for a moment. David had now been fighting with the Philistines. By the way, for those that might not know, the Philistines are the enemy of the Israelites. All right? And so David had been fighting with them for 1 year and 4 months. A lot of things can happen in 16 months. Amen? And so he's going through that. And so he had gotten to know them. He had more than likely built relationships. And guess what? David also probably knew their military strategy. But in verses 1 through 2, we do get some important military intel. The circumstances of what you're going to see tonight in chapter 29 have been building up since chapter 27. In chapter 27, David had gone over to Achish, the king of Gath. That was right after he and Saul had their last shouting match over the canyon. Y'all remember that? And so he had gone to the Philistines. And through this time, this 16-month period, David had won the trust of the king through the deceit and ruthlessness of his battle tactics. And chapter 27 mentions that. And while you can certainly question some of the tactics that David had in warfare, and the fact that he went over to the Philistines, and while he was supposedly fighting for the Philistines, he was actually fighting the ancient nations of Israel on Israel's behalf, right? He was doing these things. You can argue that, but here's one thing that David had not done up to this point. David had not laid a hand against Israel or Saul. He had not gone against God's people. He had not done that. And so we know that David was busy, according to 1 Samuel 27, verses 8 through 10, that David was busy destroying the old and ancient enemies of Israel. Everything was okay with David being in the Philistine camp except what's getting ready to happen, right? And we know that according to chapter 28, when Saul went to the witch, and the witch brought up Samuel, Samuel said, Saul, you're going to die in battle tomorrow. And so the battle that was discussing is the one that's getting ready to happen. As you see in verses 1 through 2 of chapter 29, the battle lines are being drawn. And so David is actually in a hard spot. Because if David remains in the Philistine camp, he's going to have to kill some of his own people. And what I want you to see tonight is very simple, it's not complex, is that God's sovereign hand exempts David from doing something that would have been biblically wrong. And as we're going to see by David's response, you could argue that David wanted to stay with the Philistines, and you could argue that he wanted to go home. Either way, God made the decision, and we, as outsiders looking in, can expect this military exemption. You say, how can we expect it? If I were to ask someone who is a brand new Christian, even a brand new Christian is very familiar with David, because of our culture and because of how we put him on a pedestal and things of that nature. And so it's an expected exemption because we know that David is ultimately going to become the king of Israel, right? And so it's expected that he would be exempted. But the way that God does this is awesome. According to 1 Samuel 28, verse 1, a big battle's about to ensue. And David's in a predicament. What makes all of this worse is that according to 1 Samuel 28, verse 2, we are told that Achish promoted David to his personal bodyguard detail. And so this is the second time in David's life that he is a bodyguard for a military commander. He was previously Saul's bodyguard, right? And so two different nations, two different commanders. Obviously, we know David is very talented. But see, Achish had elevated David into his own personal military detail. Why is that important? If David was going to escape, it was almost impossible now. Because as you're going to see in verses 1 through 2 of chapter 29, he and his forces were at the back end of the Philistine army. Okay, let's use common sense. Back end means we could easily get away, right? If you're in the back pew tonight, you have a higher chance to get out here quicker than somebody on the front pew. And so if you're in the back of the army, you have a better alleyway to get out of the army. Well, now that David is with Achish as the bodyguard, how am I going to get out of this one? Because if somebody comes, if somebody I know, or more than likely in David's case, somebody he's related to, comes up to him and tries to kill Achish, what's he going to do? And so this is the predicament that is ensuing here. And so this could be quite dangerous for David. He would have to fight against his own people. But what's even worse than that, see, God sees things that we can't see. And I think what David might not have saw in this moment, maybe he did, maybe he didn't, was that God did not want David to find himself in the controversy of either having physically hurt Saul or being accused of hurting Saul and creating more drama and more controversy. This situation that already had too much of it, God just says, I'm going to exempt you, I'm going to take you out, and that's exactly what happens. And he allows David and his soldiers to be able to go back to the Israelites. So let's look at this. The question I want to ask you tonight is, how and why was David exempted from military service in the Philistine army? I mean, how do you serve in an opposing military for a year and 4 months, and all of a sudden, before one of the biggest battles of your career, you just get exempted? That's interesting. Number one, I want you to see the objection from the Philistines. The Philistines are going to object David. But why? Well, let's look at it. Verse 1. Now, the Philistines had gathered all their forces at Aphek, and the Israelites were encamped by the spring that is in Jezreel. As the lords of the Philistines were passing on by hundreds and by thousands, and David and his men were passing on the rear with Achish. The commanders of the Philistines said, what are these Hebrews doing here? Hebrews look different, okay? And so you can read different ancient manuscripts of different nations, Hebrews, the pigment of their skin was a little bit darker than some of the other nations, right? And so you could point a Hebrew out based on their skin. Hebrews were known to be darker than the Egyptians. That's one way you could point them out there. You say, why was their skin darker? Guess what? I don't know. But that is what was said of how you could point them out. And so Achish said to the commanders of the Philistines, "Is this not David, the servant of Saul, the king of Israel, who has been with me now for days and years, and since he deserted to me, I have found no fault in him to this day." And so the Philistine generals are saying, we have a problem with David and his Hebrew boys being here. Achish is saying, I think he's a pretty cool guy, and he's been with me for over a year, and I haven't found any fault in him, is what he says. But verse 4, but the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him, and the commanders of the Philistines said to him, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place in which you have assigned him. He shall not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he become an adversary to us. For how could this fellow reconcile himself to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of the men here? Is not this David, of whom they sing to one another in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. There's so much to break down there that if we just read through it, we would easily miss it. All of the Philistine forces are gathered together. According to verse 2, David and his men were somewhat in the background. They were in the back. And this would have been a Philistine unit of thousands upon thousands of soldiers. We're not talking about a few Philistine soldiers. We're talking about thousands upon thousands. And they were still pinpointed as not having been Philistines. And so even with all the Philistines, the Hebrews were noticeable. Look at verse 3. What are these Hebrews doing here? Now, the other Philistine military commanders raised some good questions. And let's be honest, if the enemy is in your camp, don't you hope that somebody's going to raise a question? If the enemy is in your army, don't you hope somebody's going to say, what is he doing here? He's probably not supposed to be here. They did have some good reasons as to why the Hebrews were in their ranks. You may remember all the way back in 1 Samuel chapter 14. I want you to write that down and remember that. There was a previous battle in our study of Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 14, where there were Hebrews who actually dressed up as Philistines and actually invaded their own ranks. You might remember that. We preached about it. We talked about it. And in that chapter, the Philistines allowed Hebrews to join in their ranks, and those Philistines were wearing Philistine markings, and they were armed with Philistine weapons, and they had turned against them and begun fighting them. And according to 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 21, here's what it says. Now the Hebrews who had been with the Philistines before that time, and who had gone up with them into the camp, even they also turned to be with Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. And later on in that text, it says that the Philistines got confused, because they didn't know who the enemies were, so they started killing their own people. And so the Hebrews, along with Saul and Jonathan, created a huge disruption. And so fast forward all the way to chapter 29, these military leaders are like, Achish, why are you doing this? What is going on, man? We literally had this situation happen in 1 Samuel 14, and you think it's not going to happen again. You got to get David out of here. And he tells them, return him to the mission you had him on, which the mission that Achish had him on was what? Fighting against those other enemies of the Israelites. And so either way, God was definitely going to be glorified in this. But the chaos and the confusion of that situation had caused the Philistines of 1 Samuel 14 to kill their own. Now, while we do not know that Achish would have been aware of that detrimental military discovery, as the leader of the Philistines, he had to be aware of that. That would be like me and you being aware of the different battles that our nation has faced in history. So to aid Achish's mindset here, he had watched and allowed David to be around them for a year and 4 months. And Achish was so confident that back in 1 Samuel 28:2, Achish made him his bodyguard for life. Talk about trust. But the other Philistine commanders were skeptical, as they should have been. And so according to verses 4 through 5, the Philistine commanders give a solid reason as to why David would want to betray his host. And so kind of as a side note here tonight, I want you to be advised to not be as blinded by someone as Achish was here. Now, I'm not saying, and we'll discuss it in a moment, I'm not saying that David did have bad ideas and bad things to do to the Philistines. We'll never know. He never got the opportunity. And we'll talk about a little bit of that based on his response. But at the end of the day, Achish was blinded by his own thought of someone instead of looking at the realities. Sometimes people are going to try to persuade you and paint you a picture that you shouldn't be afraid of them or that you shouldn't have caution. And I just want to remind you that not everybody has your best interest. Not everybody has your best interest at heart. Now, while some people do, and we should look for the best in people, we also need to recognize red flags. Achish doesn't recognize those, and the commanders get involved. Look at verse 4. But the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him. And the commanders of the Philistines said to him, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place in which you have assigned him. He shall not go with us down to battle, lest in the battle he become an adversary to us. For how could this fellow reconcile himself to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of the men here? Is not this David, of whom they sing to one another in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000. So the Philistine commander suggests that David might make fun of them and rub it in their face and use their heads, right, as battle cries. And you say, well, where do they get that from? 1 Samuel chapter 18. You remember that as soon as David killed Goliath, he used Goliath's sword to cut off his head. And so the Philistines haven't forgotten that. The guy who killed Goliath and took his head off, you have him as your personal bodyguard, is what they're saying to him. And then the other thing that they are very well aware of is that all throughout the ancient world, did you know that even non-biblical sources quote the song that was sung about David? You say, what do you mean? Well, look at the song. It's right there in verse 5. We're not going to try to sing it because we don't know the beat that they had. They probably had a drum set. You don't know. It says in verse 5, Saul struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s. And so there are ancient pieces of literature that quote this song. David was infamous all across the ancient world. And so there were songs sung about him. And it also gives the idea there, it doesn't just use the word songs. The Hebrew word for dances there means bodily movement, right? So it means that there were different dances that they had to honor David. Because David had done so many things that had made him militarily very famous. And so the Philistines are like, hey, he can't be with us. People all across the ancient world know this guy. And so the second thing you see tonight, yes, you see the objection that the Philistines give David, and rightfully so. You also see the omnipresent hand of God in this situation. Pick up in verse 6. Then Achish called David and said to him, as the Lord lives, you've been honest. And to me it seems right that you should march out and in with me in the campaign, for I have found nothing wrong in you from the day of your coming to me this day. Nevertheless, the Lord should not approve of you. And so it seems that Achish is choosing to listen to the counsel he had received from the Philistine military leaders. Achish has no opportunity to go against them. If he goes against them, he loses his job, right? And so he can't do that. And so he says, okay, David, you got to go. And we know that Achish trusted David so much that he even let him go on his own military patrols where he didn't have control of him. That's how much Achish trusted him. Imagine, and the Bible doesn't tell us, but imagine how much trouble Achish got in when David later got away and went back to the Israelites, and David later became the king of Israel, and then they realized that while David was on their payroll, that he actually attacked the enemies of Israel. The Bible doesn't tell us what happened, but you got to imagine that would be kind of interesting. You don't think so? That's okay. Verse 6 is where King Achish breaks the news to David. As David hears these words from Achish, I think there's two things you can get from that question. Really not a question, but more of a statement. Number one, Achish is frustrated with the Philistine rulers. Essentially what Achish is saying is that, David, I want to keep you around, but they told me I can't. Aren't they bad? Right? Isn't the problem with them? And so perhaps that Achish is also upset, not just because he loves David, but Achish is probably like most of us in that we are very selfish human beings. And so he probably sees that if he were to keep David, the guy who has been celebrated as killing tens of thousands, then he would be keeping a military commander with expertise in battle. He was a Hebrew, and they were getting ready to fight Hebrews. So David is going to know things that the average Philistine warrior would not know. Because what? David was trained as a Hebrew warrior, right? And so Achish wants that in his back pocket. And Achish is selfish because he wants him as his personal bodyguard. So selfishness is all around this situation as well. And so he also knows that David could have strategic knowledge that could help the Philistines give them more spoils from the Israelites. So while we can say that Achish trusted David, yeah, you can say that, but Achish was also very selfish. Keep that in mind. Secondly, Achish seems to think that David would be disappointed by the news. Perhaps these two had become good friends. They spent a year and 4 months with one another. I've got to think they had a relationship. I got to think that they had shared personal components of their life. And notice in verse 6 that King Achish, you can't miss this part, King Achish was a pagan king, and he actually swore to David by the life of the Lord. He uses the Lord there, and in the Hebrew it actually means Yahweh, that he swears to Yahweh, which is the God of the Hebrews. And so he swears to David that he didn't agree with the other commanders. You've got to ask this question: was David a positive spiritual influence on Achish? I don't know. I would kind of answer and say I'm sure he remained pagan, especially after the battle with the Israelites and everything else, but we don't know because he actually uses Yahweh in a sentence, which they were not supposed to do as Philistines. So there's an interesting thought. Look at verse 7. So go back now and go peaceably, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines. Many Bible scholars and theologians have gotten hung up on this chapter. And what they've gotten hung up on, I'm not saying it's right and I'm not saying it's wrong, but they have drawn into the fact and close to the fact that they believe that the narrator of Samuel, the writer of Samuel, was comparing and contrasting Achish and Saul. That there was a comparing and contrasting going on between the two. Why? Because David had only served under two military commanders in his life, Saul and Achish. Two different nations, by the way, right? Two different armies. And so Robert D. Bergen and other scholars contrast this, but you got to keep in mind that David had gained most, if not all, of his military experience by serving two different military commanders. And Saul wanted to kill him, and when Saul didn't succeed, he proceeded to hunt him like an animal, right? Well, Achish wants David to stay, but he decides to let him go peacefully. So one king kicks him out, and then tries to hunt him like an animal. The other king doesn't want him to go, but then lets him go peacefully. Very interesting contrast. Safe to say that the writer of 1 Samuel is not a Saul fan, right? Look at verse 8. This is David's response to Achish. And David said to Achish, "But what have I done? What have you found in your servant from the day I entered your service until now, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of the Lord, of my Lord the king?" This is one of the most peculiar and perplexing parts of the entire passage, is David's response. What does David mean? Wouldn't he be happy that he didn't have to face his own people in battle? Wouldn't that be a happy thing? Well, David decides to protest the decision, or what we think is a protest. You got to remember, David is a really smart guy. He knows how to choose his words carefully. So what we think is a protest from David might not actually be, but let's dive into it and you can make your own decision. He asks three questions. Number one, he says, "What have I done?" I think here that David genuinely wants to know what he has done. If you have been asked to no longer do something, or you've been terminated at your job, or somebody doesn't want you around anymore, you want to say, "What did I do?" Right? What happened? What was the action that I gave? And so I think from a genuine personal standpoint that David actually does want to know, hey, bro, where did I go wrong? Like, what happened? Like, what did I do here? Like, I know you're telling me it was the commanders, the powers that be, but like, is there some problem that you and I have that I don't know about? Maybe. Maybe not. Obviously, we don't think so. Number two, David asked, "What have you found in your servant from the day I entered your service until now?" In other words, David is saying, am I not blameless? Have I not done everything that you've asked me to do? But he may be asking that question for another reason. Now look at the third thing David says, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my Lord the king. It's very vague. Now, the second question that I mentioned to you, maybe David is asking, where he says, what have you found in your servant from the day I entered your service until now? Maybe David is wondering, oh no, they found out that I wasn't where I said I was. That I was fighting against enemies that I was not fighting against. That I was actually fighting against enemies that would benefit Israel instead of those that would have been of the Philistines. Maybe he asked that question because of that. Maybe he's thinking that's why they're kicking me out and I've got to go. They found me out. And if he's asking that, he has to be wondering, if they did find that out, then why in the world are they not killing me? Because wouldn't they punish him for that? And so these last two questions that David asked, he asked Achish, have sparked a lot of controversy among Old Testament scholars. Notice that David doesn't specify which king. There is no specification in the Hebrew for what king he's talking about, but there's three potential options of what king he's talking about. Let's read verse 8 again just to make sure we're all on the same page. But what have I done? What have you found in your servant from the day I entered your service until now, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my Lord the king? Three potential options as to who he's talking about. He could be talking about King Achish, all right? He could be talking about King Saul, or he could be talking about Yahweh. Which one is he talking about, and why does that even matter? Now, David was so smart that if Achish used that verbiage, and the way that the Hebrew writes it is that David is not using the word Lord as in Yahweh. He's not using that form. He's using a form of a royal figure, right? Lord, lowercase l, as the translations have it. Now, David is so smart that Achish would assume in this context that David was talking about him. Because we know that Achish is already selfish. We know that he wants everything to be about him. So he's going to automatically interpret this flowery language of David saying to him, man, I'm going to miss you, man. I wanted to fight, but now I'm not going to be able to fight with you. Because you see there the phrase, the enemies of the Lord my king, thinking it could be Achish. I tend to believe that David worded this carefully on purpose. I personally think I could be wrong, and I'm okay with that. And if you have a different opinion, that's great. We can discuss it after the service. But to me, I think this means that I think David would have flipped on the Philistines. And you say, how do you know that and why do you think that? Let me tell you why. David had never verbally spoken against Saul, and he had never killed Saul when he had the opportunity. So why would he do it now? That would be my question. But David words that phrase in that sentence in such a way where Achish would think it was a compliment. But David's soldiers, he's got 600 soldiers with him, by the way, would view it as a code. Right? So Achish is so, big-headed that he thinks, oh, he's complimenting me. Thanks, man, I really appreciate it. But David's men are sitting there and they get the code. They realize that if we were going in battle, we were going to have to fight against them. And I think David realizes that Achish is that dumb that they would allow their mistakes of 1 Samuel 14 to repeat themselves. Because they're hours from the battle and they let the future king of Israel be his bodyguard. Now think about that for a moment. That's pretty crazy. Especially when you consider the history that was about to repeat itself. Now look at verses 9 through 11. And Achish answered David and said, I know that you are as blameless. And by the way, he took the bait. I know that you are as blameless in my sight as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said, he shall not go up with us to the battle. Now then, rise early in the morning with the servants of your Lord who came with you, and start early in the morning, and depart as soon as you have light. So David set out with his men early in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines, but the Philistines went up to Jezreel. Now that Achish has delivered the blow to David and himself, he showers David with compliments. In other words, he thinks David's giving him a compliment, so he gives him a bunch of compliments. I think David is smart enough to realize all this. I think David had a plan. Now, you say we can't know that. You're right. We can't know that for sure. And we can't prove that for sure. But you have to look at the respect that David had given Saul time and time again in the book of 1 Samuel. There are multiple times where David said, I will not lay a hand against God's anointed. So I've got to believe that he was going to turn against the Philistines, because the other part of that component is, why would he spend all that time fighting the enemies of the Israelites if he was just going to end up fighting the Israelites anyway? Right? It would make sense that he would switch. And so, obviously, you see Achish calls him an angel of God. The other Philistine leaders don't trust him, and they wanted him out. So God uses this. But even through this, God is able to keep and maintain David's image as an obedient servant. David doesn't fight against Achish. They just take their stuff and leave. So God is maintaining his good reputation. David and his men go south while the Philistines head north. That tells us that David and his 600 men did not fight in the battle that you see that happens in chapter 31. The battle that happens in chapter 31, and you're also going to see that while this is happening, and we'll look at it next Wednesday, but in chapter 30, you're going to see that David's wives are captured, and there's a whole lot more drama that happens with that. But if you go all the way to chapter 31, David and his men are not in the battle with Saul, which is so important because David himself cannot be accused of trying to undermine the Saulite dynasty. He can't be accused of doing that because he wasn't anywhere present. And so what's your main point, Pastor? Here's my main point. Our omnipotent and omnipresent God provided an alibi for David when he didn't even realize he needed one. And so God is working ahead. God is going before him. God knows the battle that's about to happen. And God doesn't want anything to prohibit, because once Saul is dead, it's David's time to be king. And God doesn't want David to have to fight the trivial battles of the court system into a conspiracy theory that he was trying to kill Saul. Instead, God says, you know what? I'm just going to eliminate you from the battle altogether. Sure, you could be a great ally to the Israelites and fighting against the Philistines and all that. Let's just take you out of the equation, because I don't want any disruptions or any problems when I elevate you to king of Israel. God is always working a step forward. Now, would it be easy for David or the Israelites to say, man, we could have won the battle a lot more easier if you just would have let David stay in there? Achish would have been gone. And God says, guess what? That's not a part of my plan. God has an omnipresent, omnipotent hand that is working even when you can't understand. You say, Pastor, that's so cliche. It's cliche until it happens in your life. And you see it happen, and you feel it happen, and you get out of that situation, and you say, man, I'm glad God gave me an alibi that I was able to avoid this, or I was able to avoid that. And so this chapter is pivotal among scholars because it answers the questions that many accusers would have had with David. It answers the question that David was not a conspirator, and that David was not going to the Philistines in order to try to get against Saul. That wasn't his plan. Instead, it was God's plan that David coincide with the enemy so that he could work on his behalf. God intervened like he always does. And in this situation, as it is with all, it was for his glory. Even if David was confused, Achish was obviously confused, but God had it all planned out and all mapped up that he provided an omnipotent and omniscient alibi for David to get out of that bad situation. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you that it doesn't turn back void. And Lord, if there's a situation tonight that we're dealing with that we view as hard or difficult, Lord, if it's your will,